Invicta versus LFA strawweight champs battle it out like it's Lupe Godinez taking on Emily Ducati, the only other recorded opportunity. The titleists have fought each other in the UFC like that. From those organizations, we have Kanako Murata taking on the Lil Monster, Vanessa Demopoulos. And when you look at a matchup like this, Matt, I think the biggest storyline, of course, is that of the returning Japanese fighter in this matchup. And she's got a really good story to the return, because if you look at the last UFC card that we had, who competed out of Japan on a really long layoff due to injury? It was Mizuki, and Mizuki was able to go out there, get the finish off of what? A 2.5-year layoff in that one, out of Reversal Jim Miwi. And who did she have in her corner? Kanako Murata, who's fighting on this card. Now, for Mizuki, it was major knee injuries. For Murata, her last time out, she's taking on Vina Jandiroba. First round, Jandiroba with a really tight armbar. And if you forget and you didn't watch that fight, I really do suggest that you do. Murata, when she's at her best, she's pushing a pace. She's using her wrestling. She was a world champion wrestler out of Japan when she was making the come up before she transitioned into MMA. And Murata just couldn't get anything going. It was a lot of big straight right hands. You saw Jandiroba really stumble, wobble Murata. And the two things that you remember after the first round were not only the really tight armbar that Murata was able to kind of transition through, but also remember the big swollen right eye that Murata had. And it was kind of tough to see where that came through in the exchanges. But in the second round, the commentary didn't pick up on it until about the last minute and a half. You could see the elbow was definitely dislocated. Murata posted it on her Instagram. It was. Now she's coming off of a little over a 2-year layoff to take on Vanessa Demopoulos, who, if anything, has been very active since she's joined the UFC. The one thing about Demopoulos that you either like or you don't like is she's mixed it up at a lot of different gyms. Coming into the UFC, she was billed out of California. Then she was out of Fight Ready. Then she was out of Factory X, which is where we saw her for her last fight. And then coming into this one, listen to an interview that she did with guess who? James Lynch. And she touched on the fact that she's really happy to be representing the UFC PI. It's kind of her own tailored gym situation, but out of the PI and Extreme Couture for this one. So for Demopoulos, where does the bread get buttered? She's a great grappler when it does touch the mat. It doesn't necessarily have to be her own takedown that gets it there for her to win in the scrambles. You remember her get right, kind of get back into it swing fight that she had against Sam Hughes when she was able to win the belt over with the LFA. You think about her fights that she's had in the UFC where things maybe haven't gone her way, like where she got knocked down by Silvana Gomez Juarez, only to then throw that trap card and get the submission win in her own right. But for Vanessa Demopoulos, rather, the weird parts about it are, you look at some of the losses. JJ Aldrich, up a weight class on short notice, getting struck on the outside. You look at her last time out against Karolina Kowalkiewicz, kind of the same thing. So for Demopoulos, when things are going well, it's in the same zone. She's working in some takedowns. She's pressuring her opponent like she was able to do against Maria Oliveira until she got tired in the third round, and then she became the nail to that hammer. So I'm eager to see this one, Matt, because for Demopoulos, again, I can cherry pick some of these fights. The Corey McKenna fight where she got controlled for over 10 minutes on the ground. The Murata fight against Marcos where she controlled for over 10 minutes on the ground. It's going to be an interesting fight in this one for sure.
And plan Bs are going to be very important because, like you said, both fighters, when everything is going their way, they can be that one-way traffic. But even for Kanako, I do think it's fair to bring up the fact that, hey, if she's not able to go out there and really dominate with her wrestling, is her striking from the outside going to be good enough to go out there and win a 50-minute fight, really just primarily on the feet? Now, I do think the threat of the wrestling can at least help her get closer to her opponent, maybe open up some of that striking, but it's going to come down to, can Kanako have a good enough plan B to where if the takedowns aren't having enough success, if she's not able to win a couple of rounds based on the top pressure, can her striking at least get the respect of Demopoulos on the feet? Because I don't think anybody in the gym, anybody on TV, anybody watching this fight wants to see these two strike for 15 pure minutes. I think the grappling exchange is going to be really fun between them because, like you had mentioned, and I think this really is going to be a key to the matchup, can Demopoulos do work off her back, at least in some kind of a scramble situation? Because if Murata is just really heavy in that top spot, then you don't really need to listen to us any longer. Like, she's going to be able to hold it for the majority of the fight, probably make for a bit of a stale view if we're being honest, not create too much separation to help Demopoulos. But if she can just maintain those positions, I do think Kanako can look really dominant with her own wrestling. But You bring it up too. Her last matchup against Vina, who again is extremely well-rounded, can look good in basically every aspect of MMA. It did show a lot of holes in her game, and I understand the arm was injured, but the striking defense wasn't necessarily there. So I wonder if Vanessa can have success on the feet to maybe even make Kanako the more defensive fighter from the outside.
Murata could not defend the strikes whatsoever,
No.
and her sample size in the UFC is that of a 1-1 fighter. Big win over Randa Marcos, slight underdog against Vina Jandiroba, who was ranked. But Murata was in the red corner, so always interesting to see that kind of A side, B side. But when you do look at it for Murata, a big time get right fight, that junior world championship in wrestling, kind of similar to another Japanese prospect in Rinya Nakamura, a guy who can definitely get it done on the mat. But when I look at Murata, I hope that you notice this. This is my comparison for Murata as a mixed martial artist. When the wrestling doesn't work, she looks a lot like the Guitar Hero, Justin James, with her striking.
Yeah.
It's a lot of non-striking defense, big swings, big misses, and Demopoulos can be like that a little bit. She's a little bit more tight with the striking, but when you look at it for Demopoulos, the big story here is negative strike differential in the UFC, 3.71 strikes landed per minute to 5.61 taken. And if you look at it for her as far as the takedowns, the takedown defense, she's defended 2 or 3 takedowns against her. The takedown accuracy, she's gone 3 of 20 in UFC, and
on that
I guess
Dern.
yeah, it's bad, the takedown accuracy. So again, when you look at this one, it's a little bit of a clash of styles. Murata outside of the UFC had wins over Dakota, who I already mentioned. She also had a win over one of Matt's favorite female fighters, Angela Magana. That's a big win over with Ryzen. And she also had a win over Sarai Orozco.
Please never say that ever again.
A loss to somebody who was coming outside of a 2-fight stint in the UFC. Kanako Murata at 4-0 fought Rin Nakai, somebody who wants to get back into the UFC for wins over 500 fighters and taking racy pictures on her Instagram. Matt, when you look at this fight, listen, 2-year layoff, hurt elbow, minus 300. Is it warranted? I don't think so. But Kanako Murata, is that against Demopoulos? We have a look at the Topology vote. Surprise us there to you. I'm going to say over under 85% Murata in this.
I'm going to say over.
And it is under 1,012 total votes, 78% going Murata, 88% by decision for the 22% that have Demopoulos, 75% by decision. We harped on it a little bit too much, but again, the Murata striking defense her last time out was not great. And out of recent camps, we saw her last time out competing with CSA Gym down in California. Kieran Fitzgibbon, somebody who's trained with Henry Cejudo, who's trained with Chris Cyborg. Who else? Gaston Bolaños? That's a pretty good name. Zoila Frosto, one of Matt's favorite fighters as well. But for this one, training out of Japan, maybe we see a 2-0 off of 2 respective cards. But I do see that for Murata. I think she's going to be able to get the win off that wrestling strength alone. Just where we've seen Demopoulos kind of trying to win out of some of the scrambles in her fights, and she struggled against pure wrestlers. So for that reason, I like Murata here.
I think she is going to be the much heavier fighter in that top spot. Not really allow Demopoulos to initiate her scrambling game or really threaten with a lot of submissions off her back. And again, on the feet, this probably isn't going to be a great fight, guys. Let's just call it what it is. But on the mat, I think we could get some really fun grappling exchanges between both fighters, but Murata to me is just the much more physically dominant fighter, especially with her own grappling. So for those reasons, I gotta pick her in this one.
Maybe we see that big overhand right like Demopoulos was able to throw against Maria Oliveira, but Matt, both of us going with the Japanese fighter. In this one, Kanako Murata to get back on the win streak. Some big time fights on this card, including Chris Gutierrez taking on Montel Jackson. Big time banger. You're not gonna want to miss it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. We always say, let's get into it.